Hello everybody, this is the Ruger 1022 22 caliber carbine, probably one of the most popular 22 caliber rifles ever made. And the model you see before you is over 40 years old. I've actually had it for more than 40 years. This one has stamped on the opposite side of the barrel, made in the 200th year of American liberty. So this particular rifle was actually made in 1976 when Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford were running for president. Now, the last time I took it shooting, I noticed it had trouble ejecting cartridges. I was using good ammo and having several problems with ejection, so I began to realize, of course, that the problem has to lie with the gun and not with the ammunition I was using. Well, I went online and found out that when you have ejection problems, you probably have an extractor problem. So I contacted the good people at USA Midway, and they sent me a Ruger replacement extractor. That cost me about $4 plus shipping, and USA Midway got it to me a day ahead of schedule. So I was very happy with their customer service and how quickly they processed the order. Now, let's put the thing in. But first, let's make sure that the weapon is clear. We want to make sure the magazine is out, and we want to make sure that there is nothing in the chamber. The chamber is completely empty. There are no live cartridges in the weapon right now. So even though we know it's empty, we're still going to treat it like a loaded weapon. Gun safety is critical and it saves lives. So always be mindful of gun safety. Okay, now, how do we get that old extractor out of there and that new one in there? Well, the first thing to do is to go ahead and separate the stock from the receiver group in the barrel. Now on this particular model, everything is held together with this one screw right here. Most models of the Ruger 1022 have a band about here that you would also have to take off, but not this particular model. So let's go ahead and undo that one screw. This is pretty easy and straightforward. And then once you get it going, you can loosen it by hand. Now, before we separate the stock from the receiver group in the barrel, let's move the safety to a halfway position. We don't want the safety all the way off, and we don't want it all the way on. We want it at about a halfway point so that it doesn't interfere with the stock when the stock comes off. And you'll see that that actually comes off pretty easily. It's easier than peeling a banana. Now, to remove the receiver group, we have three things that we need to be concerned with. One of these is this pin here, which is the bolt stop pin. Now this is, like I said, an old rifle. I don't know how many rounds have been fired through it, but a lot. So the bolt stop pin comes out pretty easily. It just falls right out. Now this has to come out because you won't be able to remove the bolt without first removing the bolt stop pin. Now the next thing to be concerned with is two pins that hold the lower receiver to the upper receiver. This is going to look a lot like the way that an AR breaks apart. Now, when we cleared the weapon a minute ago, we cocked the hammer on the inside of the action here. And that's important because cocking the hammer actually makes it a little bit easier to take apart. Well, let's go ahead and remove these pins. And again, when it's an older weapon, it doesn't take a lot of encouragement to get these pins to come out. And if you get one pin out, you can use it to push his friend out because both these receiver pins are the same size. Now, at this point, you have detached the lower receiver from the upper receiver just by removing a couple of pins. Now, the hammer is cocked back. If the hammer were forward, the hammer would be pushing on the bolt some, and that would make it just a little bit harder to wriggle out. Not impossible, but a little bit harder. It'd also make it harder to put back in. So make sure the hammer is cocked back when you remove this and when you put it back in. Also, if you want to drop the hammer with the receiver open and exposed like this, put your thumb on it. It's not going to hurt you. Put your thumb on the hammer before you pull the trigger and let it forward. The reason for that is if the hammer falls forward at its natural speed, you might end up having to look around on the other side of the room for the hammer strut and the coil spring that activates the hammer. So just keep your thumb on it and keep everything together inside the receiver. But keep it cocked for now, and you can lay that off to the side. And the next thing we need to get at is the bolt, because that's where the extractor is. So the bolt assembly, you've got an operating handle. This operating handle connects to a recoil spring and a recoil spring guide here, and when it's all together it flies back and forth pretty smoothly. Now you need to detach the bolt, and to do that you've got to push the bolt all the way to the rear. You push the operating handle as far back as it'll go, and now that the bolt stop pin is not in there, the bolt can actually travel back far enough for you to be able to reach in and remove it. And so once you get the bolt all the way back, you'll be able to pull it up and remove it from the receiver. Now you've got this spring guide and this operating handle under tension here, so just let that gently slide forward, and you can leave it in there. That does not have to come out for this job. Now the next thing is to get the extractor, and the extractor is this tiny little piece right here. The job of the extractor is to hold a shell casing in place so that after you have fired a cartridge, and remember you're looking at the underside of the bolt right here, so you're looking at this upside down, the bolt comes back and it pulls the empty shell casing to a fixed piece of metal called the ejector. The ejector strikes the opposite side of the shell casing and causes it to fly out of the receiver. If the extractor is a little old and a little worn, then that hinders the ejection process. So instead of the shell being held firmly in place until it's very, very decisively kicked out of the receiver, what happens is the shell gets kicked out somewhat, it rattles around inside the receiver, and then when the bolt comes back forward, it simply crunches on the shell and makes it impossible for the next cartridge in the magazine to load. And then you've got to drop the magazine and you've got to pull the bolt back and clear it out manually and ramp up another cartridge and try again. So that old extractor, that 40-year-old extractor, 40-plus-year-old extractor has got to go. Taking it out is very, very easy. All you do is simply peel it out like so, and do it carefully. Keep both fingers on it, and out she comes. Very, very easy to do. So there's the old extractor. Behind the extractor is a plunger and a plunger spring that looks like something you would have gotten out of a ballpoint pen. Now when everything is oriented properly inside the bolt, this plunger and spring assembly pushes against this part of the extractor. And so this pushes the upper part of the extractor inward because it's pivoting around this flange here that's pointing downward. And that's and this top part is the claw that grips the rim of the cartridge. So you have to have the extractor oriented like this before you replace it. So we'll lay the old one down. We'll put the plunger spring and the plunger back in place. Now the plunger spring and plunger, you don't have to take these out. You can just leave those in there. But be careful, because if something slips, something may end up going flying across the room, and then a fairly simple operation becomes an annoying one. Okay, so holding the bolt like this is the underside of the bolt, this is the bottom of the bolt. There is the side with the plunger and the plunger spring. You must have the new extractor oriented like this with the claw pointing inward. Now all you have to do is push the new extractor in down this slot until it clicks into place. Peel it back a little bit, twiddle with it a little bit, and then after a little bit, that plunger will find its place and it'll push the extractor into its place. And again, you have to play with it some, but make sure that you've got your fingers on everything so nothing pops out and gets lost. Now that that's in there, all we have to do is replace the bolt. Now on the top side of the bolt, you have this big slot cut here, and that slot is where the operating handle on the spring guide goes. So you have to align those things and click them back into place to get the bolt working again. Okay, so the next thing is, now that the bolt is missing, there's a tremendous amount of torque that the operating handle puts on onto the spring guide here. So it takes a couple of fingers to hold that back, and once you get it back, you can hold it back with your thumb like so. Now we've got to get the bolt back in, and again we've got to make sure that the top of the operating handle here goes across this slot in the top of the bolt. So let's turn it over, put it in, and maneuver it around a little bit until it finds its place, and there we go. And now that the operating handle is being held in its right orientation to the recoil spring by the bolt, the action goes pretty smoothly, as you see here. Now all we have to do is put everything back together. So let's put the receiver back on. Make sure that you're careful not to pull the trigger or handle the trigger. Also, one other thing, the ejector that I mentioned earlier is this piece of metal, and it flops around a little bit if you're not careful. So just make sure that that ejector is settled down in the slot where it needs to be before you join the receiver groups back together. Alright, that's fairly easy. You just put them together like so, and then line up and replace the receiver pins. And then once the receiver pins are in, make sure you put the bolt stop pin in. And if your weapon has a good bit of mileage on it, make sure you hold that, because that bolt stop pin falls out pretty easily. Alrighty, so let's get that set. We'll turn the whole thing upside down, move the safety back to that halfway position, and then we will put the stock back on, and everything simply fits right into place, unless you're doing a video and the bolt stop pin got a little wobbly on you. Now I got the bolt stop pin put back where it's supposed to go, and everything pops right back into place. And so you simply replace the screw like so. Make sure that's snug. And now you have successfully replaced your extractor, and you've reassembled the weapon, but you'll remember that the hammer is cocked. Now, how do we relieve the tension on that hammer without dry firing the weapon? Some people don't like to dry fire their weapons. So what you do when you have a hammer and a bolt in this kind of configuration, you have an easy solution. Just push the bolt back until you feel a little resistance. That's the hammer that the bolt is hitting. Now the bolt of course travels back a little bit farther than that, but the first resistance you meet is the hammer. So push the bolt back until it hits the hammer, and then pull the trigger and let the bolt slide forward gently, and you have relieved the pressure on the hammer and let the bolt settle forward, and you have done so without dry firing your weapon. Now let's take this thing out and see how that new extractor works.